And I'm glad you're here. I'm Drew Lathin. I'm the owner of Creating Sustainable Landscapes. We're a small landscaping company that works only with native plants. And by the time this presentation's about halfway over, I think you'll understand why. We do things like pollinator gardens and rain gardens and lawn alternatives. We do some prairie gardens and such. We also do bioengineered shorelines. But we do it only with native plants, plants that were here before European settlement. So that's enough of shameless advertising. So I'm going to begin. So back in November of 2018, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine that talked about the insect apocalypse and how we are driving down insect numbers and the dire consequences for the rest of life on the planet by eliminating insects. And that was followed up with an article in The Guardian in February of 2019, which basically said at the rate we're going, we will lose all of our insects on the planet within 100 years. And again, talking about the dire consequences of that. Back in whenever that was, September of 2019, there was a study that the New York Times related, talking about how in the last 50 years, since 1970, we've lost 29% of the bird species in North America. And then that was followed up by the UN report, the United Nations Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services talked about and shared in the Washington Post about how over the next 20 years, we are on path to eliminate 1 million plant and animal species across the planet. So in North America, we're facing currently the loss of 40%. I'm not going to go through those numbers with you. Lots of fish and mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and of course, insects that I've talked about. I'm sure many of you can remember on a summer's night driving and having your windshield splattered with bugs. And that's not so true anymore. So when you think about it, just think about how even all of us have witnessed that. And so many have talked about this being the beginnings of the sixth extinction. And the causes are mainly related to development and agriculture and the associated causes of pesticides, the loss of our native plant species, invasive species, climate change, and light pollution. So when you look at a nighttime satellite photo of the US, you can just see how much land we've gobbled up, particularly if you can see my cursor east of the Mississippi River here. Just demonstrates how much land that 55% is city and suburb in the United States. And on that land is a lot of lawn. It's just what we do. It's just what we've been taught to do in terms of landscaping. And we are still cutting down our woodlands and fields and adding across the United States 1.4 square miles of lawn a day. And we're dumping a lot of crap on them to make it beautiful. And many of these chemicals are carcinogens. And then of course there is the carbon footprint of all that mowing. And we take 30% of the water that we spend a lot of money on to clean to drinking water standards and throw it on the ground just to keep our lawns green. So we try to do everything to make it grow and then mow it to within an inch of its life. In addition to that, food now claims half the surface of the earth, and we do need to eat, but there are probably better ways of doing agriculture. And one of the bad practices, or a couple of the bad practices, are crop insurance and ethanol subsidies that are resulting in the loss of our grasslands at rates unseen since the 1920s. It's incentivizing people to farm marginally productive lands because they can get money from subsidies and insurance. Add to that the effect of invasive plants and plants that were brought here for ornamental reasons by big horticulture or for food or by accident, and have invaded not only our built areas, but our natural areas as well. And it's estimated that 1/3 of the vegetation in our natural areas are invasive species. So here's a picture of a buckthorn thicket, and nothing will grow underneath it. On the left is a picture that I took of honeysuckle in our woodlands. And this was a November picture, and it's still green. And as you drive down the road and you see these green shrubs along the side of the road, that is more than likely to be honeysuckle. And what it does is it shades the woodland floor, preventing light to get to the spring ephemerals that they need. And then on the right is garlic mustard, a plant brought here as an herb that has turned out to be highly invasive, poisons the soil, and prevents seeds from anything from anything from germinating. I'm sure all of you have seen Phragmites in every roadside ditch and wetland. There's really tall grass. And as you can see from this picture, there's a near complete loss of the biodiversity in there. It's just the monoculture of Phragmites. Add to that the fact that big horticulture has brought in species of plants from other continents that have diseases that our native plants don't have defenses for. And it has resulted in the near loss, the near total loss of our eastern chestnut, which was once the most abundant tree in the Appalachian chain. You all, I'm sure, have heard of Dutch elm disease. There's a picture of our native flowering dogwood, a beautiful understory tree in our woodlands that you really can't improve on, but big horticulture thought it was a good idea to bring in Asian dogwoods that are no more beautiful, but they sometimes come with dogwood and anthracnose that our native dogwoods don't have any defenses against. And then sudden oak disease was brought on foreign nursery stock. So in a wound of a red oak in particular, if this fungus gets into it, it can kill the tree within 2 weeks and then spread via roots to adjoining trees. So if anybody has any oak trees, now is not the time to prune them. December, January, and February only. So the bottom line is that between 95 and 97% of the original US landmass has been cut, plowed, or paved. Look out the window, even into the woods, and certainly along roadsides in our developments, very, very few of the trees that are there are original. So that's the bad news and the definition of the problem. So let's switch gears a little bit. And by a raise of hands, how many of you like birds? Of course, I can't see all of you. I'm raising my hand. I'm sure you all like birds. So the question is, what do birds eat in the spring? They are, in general, eating insects. They're not eating seeds. The seeds are largely gone. They're not eating berries. The berries are gone as well. And so they're eating insects, and in particular, caterpillars. So when you look at this chickadee here, it will only go for in a 50-yard radius to get caterpillars to feed their young. And they use caterpillars because they're soft, and they can shove the caterpillar down their baby's throat without harming it. But the numbers that they need are just astounding. So every day, a chickadee needs to collect, the mother and the father need to collect between 350 and 570 caterpillars every day for their nest. And so over the 16 days that they raise their clutch, that's between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars that is needed just for one chickadee nest. And they need all of those caterpillars within a 50-yard radius. So if that number of caterpillars is not available, that nest is going to fail. But that's just one chickadee nest. So think about two chickadee nests and a robin's nest and a wren and a cardinal and all of the other birds around. 96% of our terrestrial bird species are feeding their young caterpillars. So the number of caterpillars that are needed is just astronomical in order to support bird populations. And of course, I shared with you some data earlier that showed that over the last 50 years, we've lost 29% of our bird species. And that's because basically, among other reasons in terms of pesticides and so on, there is not enough food for them. Well, in addition to birds, lots and lots of things are eating insects, from spiders to toads to frogs, salamanders, skunks, bats, foxes, opossums, and so on. Lots of things are eating insects. So a world without insects is really a world without biological diversity. Insects make the world go round, and they feed at the bottom of the food chain many species of animals. All right, so we've established the importance of insects. So now, what do insects eat? Because they need to be able to have food in order to survive, in order to be able to feed the animals up the food chain. And they're eating plants. For the most part, insects are eating plants. We're not talking about the mosquito that bites you, but they're eating plants. And so with all these insects around eating plants, in fact, 37% of all animal species worldwide are herbivorous insects, insects that are eating plants. So plants have evolved certain mechanisms, defense mechanisms, to protect themselves. Things like thorns on roses. Now that doesn't protect them from insects, but it'll protect them from other herbivores like deer and other things and kids. Lignins and grasses that make it undigestible, and then chemical toxins in the tissues of the plant. And it's these chemicals that are the most common defense mechanisms for plants. So bitter tastes, or many of them are toxic in terms, they're cyanides and nicotine and glycosides in the leaves of plants, in the tissues of plants, that make them very difficult to be able to eat. So when you think about an onion, for example, God didn't put an onion on this planet for us to cut up and put into frying pans. What the onion does to your sinuses and your eyes is actually a chemical defense to keep things from eating it. Because most people will not just grab an onion and bite it. I'm sure there's one or two people out there that are going, yeah, I'll do that, but you're in the minority. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between insects and plants, and let's start by talking about monarchs, because they're a charismatic species. They have this astounding migration pattern, and we hear a lot about them in the news, mostly bad news because of their declines. So monarchs have a relationship with milkweeds. The adult monarch, pictured there, can take nectar from many species of plants, but the caterpillars can only eat milkweeds. They can't eat anything else any more so than you and I could start eating oak leaves. When you look at, and I'm sure all of you have, or many of you have ripped open a milkweed leaf and you see that white sap coming out. It's toxic. It's a cardiac glycoside. So any little critter that comes along and bites into it could have its heart stopped by that. And if that doesn't deter or stop something from eating it, the sap is gooey, and it gums up the eating parts of the insects so that they can't eat it. So this is a defense mechanism that milkweeds have evolved in order to deter insects from eating it. So when you look at this picture of a monarch caterpillar eating the leaf of a milkweed, what you don't see is the sap in there. And so what happens is, and again, if you could see my cursor, the caterpillar comes out here and snips the petiole. that supplies all of the it's the vessels that supply the sap to the leaf, and then it could walk down to the bottom of the leaf here and start chewing away. So the toxin doesn't get in the way of the caterpillar eating it, because monarch caterpillars are immune to that toxin, but the sap can gum up the eating parts. So the monarch caterpillar has evolved this behavioral adaptation to be able to eat milkweed leaves. And the loss of milkweed is the reason why we have monarch decline. Since Monsanto introduced Roundup resistant genetically modified crops like corn and soybeans, farmers have been able to spray their agricultural fields with Roundup, and that's resulted in the loss of milkweeds and the immediate loss and decline of our monarchs. And, you know, we're down, depending upon the year, somewhere between 80 and 95% loss of monarchs. So this is just one relationship, one plant-insect relationship between an insect and a native plant. But like the monarch, 90% of our insects are specialists. So here's pictured the Carner blue butterfly, the federally endangered Carner blue butterfly, and it can only eat wild lupine, Lupinus perennis. And so like the monarch and the Carner blue, 90% of our insects have a very narrow range of plants. And that's because they've evolved the adaptive mechanisms to be able to eat those plants and get beyond the chemical defenses. So the Hebrew will only eat the leaves as a caterpillar of black gum. The fawn sphinx only ashes. The royal walnut moth only walnuts and hickories. The witch hazel dagger moth will only eat the leaves of witch hazels. And I can go on and on. So insects can eat plants when they've evolved certain adaptive mechanisms. The first is their ability to find their host plant. If you've ever watched a female monarch looking to lay her eggs, she'll just keep flying around and flying around until she sees a milkweed, and then bam, land right on the milkweed. So she has very good plant ID skills. The second is the ability to synchronize their life cycle with the plants that they need. So milkweeds have not emerged from the ground here yet, so you won't find any monarchs here. They migrate up from Mexico at about the pace that milkweeds are emerging in the ground. My guess is the milkweeds are probably starting to emerge now down in like southern Illinois and Kentucky, and it'll be another couple weeks at least before milkweeds emerge from the ground here. So we won't see any monarchs. The third is physical and behavioral adaptations to eat their hosts. So like the monarch caterpillar snipping the petiole to be able to go then walk out to the leaf and eat it. And the fourth are the digestive enzymes to detoxify, get those plant chemicals out of their system so that they're not poisoned by those chemicals. And these evolutionary processes take thousands of years to occur. And so what that means is those 90% of our insects that are specialists can only eat native plants. So they can't eat anything else. So you can't bring a plant from China in and expect our insects to eat it, except for maybe some of the 10% that can't eat native plants. And so it's the leaves generally that feed the young, the caterpillars and the young insects. So butterfly bush is a, excuse me, butterfly bush, beautiful plant, but it's from China. And it has chemical defenses in it that allow for exactly 0 species of insects to eat it. So this plant is sold to us by big horticulture as supposedly great for butterflies, and it will feed adult butterflies, but it feeds no caterpillars. So it begs the question, why feed the adults when you're starving the kids? So imagine sitting down at the dinner table with your kids or your grandkids or your nieces and nephews, excuse me, and grabbing the dinner platter, shoveling some food onto your plate, and turning to the kids and saying, sorry, you can't eat. And that's what butterfly bush is doing. It's feeding the adults and it's starving the kids. So, there's another picture of butterfly bush. It's one of my favorite hated plants. And insects can't eat it because they have not had enough evolutionary time to be able to get past the chemical defenses in it. And it's that leaf chemistry that's most difficult to overcome. And we're also now starting to understand that butterfly bush is an invasive species. So compare it to this oak tree that I took from standing far back. And it's beautiful and it's lush and just a gorgeous tree. And when you get up close to look at it, you will see that its leaves are torn and tattered and there are holes in them. And this is good news because what it means is that it's feeding the insects. And so oaks are the most productive plant species in our region. They will feed more than 500 species of butterflies as caterpillars. So it's great to have an oak tree. So when you don't have native plants in your landscapes, you don't have insects. This is a list of our usual suspects, and you look at that and you see, for instance, boxwood, a very common landscaping plant, feeds one species of insect. The forsythia now are in bloom, but it's only feeding one species of insect. Compare that to a random sample of native plants that I picked, and you can see that there's no contest between the number of species of insects fed by native plants versus non-native plants. So Doug Tallamy, who is an entomologist at the University of Delaware, went out one day and counted at head height how many caterpillars he found on his white oak tree on his property. And you can see those numbers there. And then he walked over to his neighbor's yard and counted the number of caterpillars on his invasive Bradford pear, and he counted one caterpillar. So there's a huge difference, and there are huge differences in the nutritional value of the berries from native shrubs to non-native shrubs. So the top ones are native. And particularly in the fall, having high fat content in berries is very important for birds to get the energy to be able to make their long migrations. But the ones on the bottom that are also producing fall berries are very low in fats and they're high in sugars, not what the birds need. So the berries make a big difference as well. So the bottom line is that native plants produce 4 times the insect biomass, 3 times the insect species, 13 times more caterpillar species, and 35 times the caterpillar biomass. That's 3,500% more caterpillar biomass. And what that means is if you picked all of the caterpillars off native plants and picked the caterpillars off non-native plants, the weight of them would be 35 times greater from the native plants than the non-native plants. So in summary, in landscapes, we use native plants because of habitat. Plants being the only thing that can convert the energy of the sun into biomass, which then feeds those 90% of insects that can only eat native plants, which then feeds the 96% of terrestrial bird species that can that feed their young caterpillars and amphibians and all the other myriad insects or animals that eat insects, and then the things that eat the insects. So that heron does not eat insect, but its food supply does. So it is dependent on insects as well. Bees are picky eaters too, and it only makes sense that our indigenous bees are 4 times more likely to take nectar and pollen from native plants than non-native plants because they co-evolved with them. And in fact, 20% of our bees are monoelectric or oligoelectric and will take nectar from only a very, very narrow range of plants. So it's important for bees as well to have native plants. And here's the thing about native plants. They evolved here in our region. And so they are able to tolerate the sub-zero temperatures we usually get in the winter. We did not get any this winter, but you can bet your bottom dollar that we're going to have heat, we're going to have drought, and they can tolerate that, and they can tolerate insects eating them, and they can do that without any supplemental water or fertilizer or spraying, because nobody did that for them while they evolved. And they can do that because of their deep root systems. So here with my cursor is the root system of turf grass. So somebody has their microphone non-muted.
Yes, and it's very annoying. We can't hardly hear you.
Yeah, so everybody make sure that your microphones are muted. So here is the root system of turf grass with its 4-inch deep root system. And you can see the root systems here of these native plants that have root systems that are 5, 10, and in some cases 15 feet or more deep. And so when it's dry out and hot out, they don't even know it's dry because they have these deep root systems. It's my spring allergies, not COVID. So with these deep root systems, they're able to get the water and the nutrients they need. Here's a picture of my front yard, and you can see from the little bit of turf grass I have left in it, how dry it had been when I took this picture. This was in a drought year. My irrigation system hasn't worked for 6 years at my house, and I have no plans on fixing it. But look how green and lush the plants are in the beds, and that's because of their deep root system. So the advantage of native plants are increased habitat, which I've talked about, and the wildlife that you attract, and I'll show you pictures of the wildlife I've attracted at my house. You can eliminate inputs such as water and chemicals, which lowers your water bill, no chemicals, which then of course makes it a healthier place for wildlife, for you, your kids, your grandkids, your pets. But this is the way big horticulture is teaching us the landscape, and by bringing in plants from other continents. And I think this happened because when we became affluent enough, there was this mindset of why should I landscape with a roadside weed when I can get an exotic plant from Africa or from China? And we didn't understand back then that the fact that these plants can be invasive or bring diseases or don't support wildlife. But we know that now. And despite that, we still see things like the Proven Winners brand, and what we're taught in terms of landscaping practices on Home Depot commercials and Scott's commercials and your General Garden magazine. It's really an unsustainable kind of way of landscaping. We need water, we need fertilizer, and of course we're not supporting wildlife. And so as we're landscaping, our landscapes generally lack layers. Go out into your nearest park and you'll see a canopy layer and a shrub layer and an herbaceous layer. But the picture on the left there is generally how we landscape. And so that used to be forest. And so it's clear out, I'm moving in. One day I was driving and I said, oh, look, Wild Oak Meadows. It's on Wild Oak Lane. There's a nice big bur oak out in front, and I go in and it is neither. This is the way we landscape, and a lot of those are invasive Bradford pears. Here's the intersection of Acorn Trail and Overlook Trail. There is not one tree there that produces an acorn. And the Overlook Trail, and the Overlook is into a mode detention basin. It's apocalyptic. Here's Northridge Woods. Here is Heritage Woods. If you pay attention, you will see that new developments are often, if not mostly, named after what they destroyed. And so I have this feeling that these developers have hired a consulting firm named George Orwell and Associates to help them come up with names for their new subdivisions. So that was a little bit of ecology. Still going to talk a little bit about landscaping practices. So we have landscapes without nature because we're landscaping with non-native plants. And of course, I'm sure you'll recognize that we've been taught that the only good insect is a dead insect, but God forbid we see any insect damage on a leaf. We're taught to kill them when we see them. We're taught to select plants that are pest-free. And so we live in landscapes with few insects. And of course, now you understand that without insects in our landscapes, we're not going to have birds and we're not going to have other wildlife as well. So again, we use plants because they support insects and up the food chain, predators. And when we landscape in ways that we don't use native plants, we're not going to have insects, and that'll cascade all the way up the food chain. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about the way out and a new way of thinking about landscaping. It starts with the understanding that nature no longer exists out there somewhere, and that we can do whatever we want. We know that our natural areas are no longer large enough to support biodiversity. By nature of the loss of insects and birds and other animals as well. And the fact that even our natural areas are starting to become infested with invasive species. We should certainly work to conserve those. But the front line in the battle for nature has now moved to our front yards and our backyards and our parking lots and our ditches and our schools, so that we can all become the ecological warriors of the future as gardeners and land managers and school teachers and such. And we can do this in a very apolitical way. You don't have to join the Sierra Club or the Natural Resources Defense Council to be able to do this. And those groups have political bents that may or may not coincide with yours. I have clients that are way on the left, and I have clients that are way on the right. And that doesn't seem to matter. They've both drunk the Kool-Aid in terms of understanding the ecology of our landscapes. And so our landscapes can't just be ornamental anymore. They have to clean our stormwater and be that genetic reservoir for diversity. And really the most important place we can do this, and the place that most of us here have control over, are our residential landscapes. And so in 2012, the US Department of Agriculture estimated that there are 103 million acres of residential land. That's more, no, I'm not going to say that. That's a lot of land. So that's a lot of land that can be supporting wildlife by using native plants. In the past, we would choose plants just for their decorative value, mostly. And so what I'm talking about is balancing that. Our landscapes should be beautiful. They should certainly be beautiful to people, and we work very hard to do that for our clients. But they also have to store carbon and create pollinator habitat and support wildlife. And we need to balance those things. So let's talk now some specific landscaping principles, and I'm going to talk about design, and I'm going to talk about management. So the first principle in landscaping is to match plants to the conditions in which they evolved. So we always had sand, loam, and clay soils, dry and wet, sun and shade. and all combinations of those. And so the thing to do is to understand, is to use the plants that evolved in the conditions you have. So if you have sand, dry, and in full sun, you're going to use plants that evolved in a sand prairie, for example. And this is one example of it. Here's butterfly weed. You can see it's a short plant by the swallowtail that is there. It's about 18 inches tall. But look how crappy that soil is. It's just a sandy, gravelly soil. There are almost no nutrients in it, but it can survive because it has a 10-foot deep taproot. So a gardening magazine and a typical landscaper would tell you that, oh, you can't grow anything here. You need to amend the soil with topsoil or compost. And that's utter nonsense. You're going to use plants that evolved in these soil conditions. And I can give you a list of 30 that will be beautiful and lush in those soil conditions. Now, whereas this plant will do great here in the sandy, sunny, dry area, it doesn't stand a chance here, or vice versa. And from time to time, we have the opportunity to plant into standing water. And so we'll use plants that thrive in standing water. Here's a picture of my marsh marigold in my backyard. I took this a number of years ago, but this is what my backyard looks like today. And that marsh marigold is right at the edge of my pond. When it rains like it did today, the water comes up a little bit and they're in standing water, but at their driest, they're in mucky soil. But they're very happy there. And this is looking at it from the other side, actually from my neighbor's property. And this area in here, if you can see my cursor, has standing water in it 365 days a year. But the plants aren't drowning or anything. They are, I'm just using wetland species of plants that like to have their feet very wet. So use plants that evolved in the conditions that they evolved. And so when you do this, you don't have to amend soils. You can use the soil that you have. You don't need to change the drainage patterns. People say, I have this really wet area. And I spoke to this other landscaper and he wants to put in a $5,000 French drain system. I go, no, we're just going to use wetland plants and I'm going to save you $4,000. And then of course it results in reduced maintenance and watering needs because you don't have to water because the plants are in the conditions that they like. All right, so that's the first design principle. The second one is to plant in masses and drifts. There are a couple things. I took this picture at the Kresge Foundation in Troy, and you can see rather than the typical landscape pattern of plant mulch, the plants are packed in tight here. And by doing that, you make the landscape legible, you eliminate the need for mulch, and it becomes more weed resistant. Here's a client site that we did, and you could see a mass of prairie dropseed here, a mass of a fern here. Here is prairie smoke here. Here's a mass of iris. And rather than, a lot of people's temptation when they go to the nursery is to get one of 14 things. You might instead just get 10 of 3 things. And so when you mass it together like that, it doesn't look weedy. You can see the patterns in there. And so now this prairie smoke here, took a picture of this from up top a little bit earlier, or a little bit earlier in the season. Prairie smoke is starting to bloom right now. And so this is a May picture of prairie smoke. And you can see that mass in the drift. Here is pickerel weed with the purple flower on the right and prairie dropseed on the left. And the thing about this, and this too, is that pickerel weed is actually planted in standing water. It's in a foot of water. And the prairie dropseed to the left is high and dry. But again, masses and drifts. And you limit the number of species, and it's calming and it doesn't look weedy. Here's a mass of gray-headed coneflower around this utility pole and mailbox. This is the side of my house with wild bergamot and purple coneflower. So when you plant in masses and drifts, it's easier for an insect to find its host, and it could do so with greater efficiency, and it increases cross-pollination. As I've said, it makes the landscape legible. It also allows for the elimination of mulch. Now we put down mulch for the first time, but after the plants fill in, you don't need mulch because the plants are dominating, the plants you put in are dominating, and they're suppressing weeds because they're shading the soil, they're taking up the nutrients in the soil and monopolizing the water. That doesn't mean that, so you don't need mulch for weed suppression. It doesn't mean that there's going to be no weeding, but there certainly will be less weeding. And then you're building communities of plants that coexist in nature. So this picture here, both the wild bergamot and the purple coneflower co-evolved in the North American prairie. And so I know I can put the two of them right next to each other without any space, and they're not going to overrun each other. Next principle, layer your vegetation. Try to mimic that natural canopy, shrub, and herbaceous layer whenever you can. So remember, I talked about more than 500 species of caterpillars that eat oaks. But of those, 94% of them pupate in the soil. So the caterpillar will be eating the leaves and then drop out of the ground, drop out of the tree into the soil or into leaf litter to finish its life cycle. So it's not good enough to just say, I have an oak tree, because if you have lawn underneath it, those 94% of those caterpillars are going to drop out of the tree and then get mowed. So you need to put layers underneath. So here's my new canopy layer with my river birch. Here are shrubs, red twig dogwood here and over here. And then the herbaceous layer, the black-eyed Susans and the cardinal flower and the blue lobelia and the fox sedge and the wild strawberries, so that whenever a caterpillar will drop out of here, it has a place to hide down below in order to complete its life cycle. And here's a different picture underneath an oak tree. So not only is it beneficial to the wildlife, but it's beautiful as well. Beautiful to wildlife and beautiful to people. So the benefits of layers, you mimic those natural settings and provide places, and you provide those full layered wildlife benefits, things being able to start their life cycle in the trees and end it on the ground. The next principle is to limit lawn only to areas that need it for play spaces or pathways, for boundaries as a buffer and entertainment spillover area. So here's an aerial of my house, my neighbor, lot of lawn, another neighbor, lot of lawn, neighbor, lot of lawn. The neighbor behind, whoa, hang on. The neighbor behind me, he's got 3.9 acres, and you could see the mow patterns in it. But here's my house. I don't do any entertaining or playing ball in the front yard, so why would I have lawn in my front yard? So, here's a perennial bed, here's a rain garden, there's a rain garden, there's another perennial bed. And I just have pathways of grass there to be able to walk. Now I have a little more lawn in the back because my patio is not quite big enough if we have more than 4 people over. So place for people to walk. And there's the pond and this area that we've been looking at. Here is my neighbor's front yard, and there is my front yard. Very, very different. And you can see the pathways of grass. Pathways here. Here's some grass as a border between this rain garden and the sidewalk. And here's a side view of that. You can see the pathway. And I make my pathways wide enough for 2 people to be able to walk side by side. This is an early August picture. Here's a client's front yard and only pathways of grass. All right, another principle is to have things flowering throughout the whole growing season. One, people like to see color, but it also supplies bees with nectar and pollen across the growing season. And it makes the planting dynamic so that the color moves around and the colors shift. Here's a lawn extension that we did for somebody in Northville. This is a May picture. And there it is in July. And there it is in September. I'll do that again. There's May, July, and September. So it's different. It's different every 2 months. Here is that house where we there's no lawn in the front, and you could see the butterfly weed here and the yarrow there. And then a month later, here's the gray-headed coneflower and the purple coneflower in there. So we're getting color across the season, and it's dynamic and it looks different. Another principle, formal in the front, wild in the back. It's your house and you could do what you want with it as long as you're not violating ordinances and HOA rules. But in general, your neighbors aren't going to like to see a tall grass prairie in the front, even if you can do it. So make it neat in the front and go wild in the back. But neat in the front doesn't mean just lawn. Again, there's a picture of my front, and I consider this neat and formal because the plants are in masses and drifts. So this is the front, but that's the back. This is actually on my neighbor's property. He let me put a prairie in on a couple thousand square feet of area. But it's way back behind his house. It's back behind my house. And so you can go wild there and do it with seed. Here's a client where we did formal in the front, and we just did a short prairie grass for the most part in the front. It's very, very neat and clean, and it isn't wild and crazy. But here's the back. And it's informal and intermixed. Another principle is wild in large spaces. I don't know if anybody here has multiple acres, but I'm sure all of us have driven out into the country and seen somebody mowing 5 acres of lawn. And so instead, you can turn them into prairie. So this picture is of out in front of Delta Dental in Okemos. I took this picture at the Chicago Botanic Garden. This is the house of the president of Bowling Green State University. It's back behind a friend's house. So another principle is don't forget about grasses and sedges. They form the structure of a planting. People generally think about just using flowers, but grasses can be beautiful as well. So here's little blue stem. Here's what it looks like in the fall as it's starting to turn crimson with the seed heads on it, backlit. And the nice thing about grasses is they maintain their structure. They look exactly the same way in the winter as they do in the summer, just not being green. Grasses have a lot of winter interest. Here's prairie dropseed in September, in November with dew on it, and in December with hoarfrost on it. And this is the same species. This is prairie dropseed. This was my lawn extension in front of my house when I lived in Ann Arbor. This is a bioswale in a parking lot with just 4 species of sedges. Another principle is to use cues to show that your landscape is intentional. You can use signs, grass as borders or rocks as edges. You can use piled rocks. You can use sculptures. And you could use walls, hedges, and fences. So that's it for design. And let's talk about management. So when you plant in dense drifts and masses, you have less weeding and no more, and so you don't have to keep putting mulch in. Plants are the mulch. When you have the right plant in the right place, in the conditions in which it evolved, you're not going to water. And then all you do is edit to preserve the legibility. So as you may think of that as weeding instead of editing. So as a plant that you planted one place ends up in another place, you might pull it and treat it as a weed. But a very important principle is to leave your leaves. Imagine all the people who rake their leaves in the fall and turn around and buy mulch in the spring. So this is free mulch, and your plants will come up through it. But the important ecological thing about this is those leaves provide shelter. So in the instance of this, I can't remember whether this is a question mark or comma butterfly, but it overwinters as an adult. And so if you rake your leaves and get rid of them, you are getting rid of this guy. But you're also getting rid of the eggs and larvae of other adult butterflies. There is a Luna moth cocoon. You would never just see that, but rake your leaves and you're getting rid of that Luna moth. Another principle is don't cut your plants down in the fall. Leave the seed heads up. That's your winter bird feeder. And then, you've done everything you can to support wildlife in the summer, but it isn't just the summer. And so by leaving the stubble up, you're leaving places for wildlife to hunker down over the winter. And when you cut in the spring. I just cut my beds down this past weekend. But when you do cut it, you only want to cut to 15 inches high, because in hollow stems or in the pith of stems, bees will come lay their eggs in them. So you don't want to cut it all the way down to the ground. And when you do cut it, just drop it. You don't have to clean it. It's free mulch. It's going to add organic matter to the soil. And the new plants that come up are going to come up around it and hide that soon anyway. And then, of course, never any pesticides. You're not going to need to water, hardly at all. No fertilizing, no mulching. And one that I've come to understand recently is put your outside lights on motion detectors. Birds are migrating now, and they migrate mostly at night, and artificial lights confuse them. So I understand why it's important to have lights outside at night for security reasons, but put them on motion detectors. And then, of course, in the summer, you've seen, all those moths flying and insects flying around those lights when they could be out there feeding and laying eggs instead. So they'll fly around those lights all night long, exhaust themselves, and then just drop to the ground and die. All right. So now I'm going to show you pictures of wildlife that has shown up in my yard. I have a 1/4 acre in the middle of a suburb, in a sterile, soulless suburb here in Novi, where everybody around me is doing everything they possibly can to kill every last single piece of life around me. But on my 1/4 acre, here's a bumblebee in my wild bergamot, a bumblebee on my swamp milkweed, and then you'll notice the milkweed beetle underneath it there. There's another bee on purple coneflower. This is bottle gentian in my front yard rain garden. You can see it's a closed flower. Only our native bumblebees are strong enough to open that and pollinate it. Gulp. So that's pretty cool. And that's going on every sunny September afternoon. Here is New England aster in October, and look at all the bees on it. So this is actually beekeeping. I'm supporting native bees, and you'll see there's some honeybees in there as well. But beekeeping really is not building an artificial structure for a European species of bee. What I don't get is why we think that importing a European species of bee is the answer to to preserving our bees. And while I was there, that guy showed up. It's a yellow sulfur. Here's a wasp, a very tame wasp on my swamp milkweed. It's a gorgeous little creature. And this is going on all afternoon. This would be July and August. And they're pollinating that plant. Because I have a pond, I'm also raising dragonflies. Here's a little video of a hummingbird moth. That's actually a moth. And there is the caterpillar of a spicebush swallowtail. And as the name would imply, it can only eat spicebush. Spicebush is a shade species of shrub that likes medium to moist soils. So I have this on the north side of my house. And I went out there one day and lo and behold, there was that guy. And there's the adult on the right later in the season. And then I have plenty of milkweed, so I have monarchs. And I took this little video last September as the monarchs were starting to migrate. Monarchs on their migration love blazing star. And there is a tussock moth caterpillar and milkweed beetles. That's on my spicebush. I don't know what that guy is. Spicebush supports about 18 species of caterpillars. So that's one of the other 17 other than the spicebush swallowtail. And I don't know who that guy is on my wild bergamot, and a cicada on my little blue stem. And because I have a pond, there's a male American toad making a racket looking for a woman. And when he does that and gets her, you get to witness toad porn. And then you get babies. In addition to that, the green frogs just showed up. And they're reproducing in there as well. There is I think that's a female ruby-throated hummingbird on my cardinal flower in my front yard rain garden. Mourning dove coming for a drink. Had a great blue heron show up one day. There is a goldfinch eating the seeds of columbine on the left and rosinweed on the right. Robin coming for a bath. A Nashville warbler. There's Mr. and Mrs. Duck. They've been coming every spring since 2015. And I think it's the same pair. There is a robin eating the berries, the high fat berries of red twig dogwood. Even had a female belted kingfisher come one day and pluck a goldfish out of my pond when I had goldfish in it. And because I leave my plants up, I have tons of birds in the winter just eating the seeds, and don't need to buy a bird feeder. And if this were live and I were in front of you, I'd ask you what eats songbirds other than cats. And the answer to that is Cooper's hawks. And so I have Cooper's hawks in my yard. I also have a brush pile, which is places for things to go live and hide in a storm. Birds will go hide there in the storm. But I also have, and so I have opossums raccoons, and because of that, I have coyotes, and I'm regularly picking up coyote poop in my yard. The coyotes have completely, come the summer, they completely clean out the feral cat population and the rabbit population. So in closing, if insects were to disappear, most of our flowering plants would go extinct, and of course our food webs would collapse, and that'd be detrimental to humanity as well, aside from just the ethical concerns of wiping out wildlife. And so you can start by ripping out everything and starting all over again, and I highly recommend it, but it can be costly and take a lot of effort to do. So back off some if you're not going to take that path, and take out a little lawn every year and add a perennial bed or a rain garden, or flip a perennial bed. If you have a perennial bed with horticultural weeds in it, then rip them out and put natives in. And at the other end of the spectrum is just replace anything that dies with a native plant. So compared to landscapes, to native landscapes, yards that are dominated by plants from other continents will produce 75% fewer caterpillars. They'll be 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees, with 1.5 fewer eggs, 29% less likely to survive, with fewer fledglings and delayed maturation. There's this Native American proverb that talks about how the land is not theirs, not yours, but it's your children's land, and that we're merely borrowing it from them. And I think any one of us who may borrow a tool from a neighbor or something, if it needs a little oiling, will then oil it and fix it up before they return it, return it in better condition. And so returning the land in better condition, our children's land, returning it to them in better condition is something that's very easy to do. And it can be done merely by increasing the native plant content in your yards. So that is the end, and I will entertain questions. Rob, I will let you moderate this, or I don't know how you want to do this.
Okay, I think there's a way where people can raise their hands. Is that correct? So we'll try to do it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, Robin has a question.
Well, pardon me, that's not corona, so I have asthma. I'm gonna drink a little water here. I just wanted to thank Drew. Your house is beautiful, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. I'm part of the Rain Gardens of Detroit, and we work with Cindy Ross, Friends of the Rouge, and the Sierra Club. And what we're trying to do in the city of Detroit is introduce Detroit residents about rain gardens. And this was so enlightening, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So I didn't have a question. I just wanted to show you that I do know how to raise my hand in the chat group, and I would look forward to being invited to more. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for your comment.
Okay, and for those coming in late, this is being recorded, so you can watch it on YouTube. Just look up on YouTube, do a search for Dearborn Heights Libraries. Okay, and Amy has a question.
Hi, Drew. Thanks for a great presentation.
Amy, can you speak up, please?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative and interesting. We have almost 3 acres, and we're interested in getting rid of most of our turf grass and, making it become as much native plants as possible. And we know we can't do it all at once, but can you just go over what is the best way when you're going to work on an area to get rid of the turf grass that's there? Would you recommend covering it with plastic or removing the grass, or what do you think?
So, so some of you are going to be shocked at the answer I'm going to give you. So I don't think plastic is a good way of doing it, because you can never get rid of plastic. So that's not a sustainable way of doing it. It's really, when you're talking large areas, it's not very practical to strip the sod. It's high effort, high cost. And then what are you going to do with all of that sod? So you could smother it with cardboard. That will take quite a while, but that also won't be perfectly effective. So really the best way of doing that is to actually use an herbicide and to kill that grass. And it actually, for a large area, if you're going to seed it, it actually takes three herbicide sprays. And if I could see you, you'd all probably be looking in horror. But when you take the long view and you think about having turf grass that's not supporting anything, and using a little bit of herbicide judiciously for the end results that you get, in terms of the biodiversity you create, it's really the easiest, best way of doing it.
Okay, well, I was surprised to hear that answer, but I'm kind of relieved because it sounds easier. Then what about, using the herbicide, does that damage the nutrients in the soil for a while or anything?
So there is some evidence to that effect, but again, over the long haul, that's going to repair.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay, go
Can
ahead,
you hear
Alan.
me?
Yes.
So I have a small part of our lawn dedicated to just growing whatever naturally comes up. I heard that's kind of a good thing to do. There seemed to be some goldenrod and aster growing there before we
Yep.
moved in. We've only been here for a few years.
Yep.
I've let that go.
Yep.
I've kind of contained it to that area. It does send out runners and
Yep.
spread, but I'm maintaining it. Is there any reason why I shouldn't have, more than like a 6 foot by 5 foot section of goldenrod? Should I be introducing something else? Is that a species that shouldn't be there?
So you probably have Canada goldenrod, and although it's native, it's very, very weedy.
Mm-hmm.
There are less weedy goldenrods, but it's still a very important, that and asters are very important for migrating monarchs in the fall, because
Okay.
they need nectar and energy to migrate. So, there are some other goldenrods you could put in there, but if you're okay with that with Canada goldenrod in there, and it's probably a weedy aster as
Mm-hmm.
well, it's serving the purpose.
Okay. I did notice that the goldenrod seemed to attract a lot more yellow jackets and wasps kind of thing, because it's nectar, and like the aster is more like pollen for like bumblebees and honeybees. Would you recommend, like, maybe if I can just feed out some of the goldenrod near the aster to encourage the aster to grow more?
No,
Or
just
kind of keep
leave them all.
what's
I
going?
mean, the yellow jackets need to eat as well. They're good pollinators.
Okay.
Just don't be charging in there and getting stung.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and this question is from Angie. Go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have a good resource where I would be able to go look at names or pictures of plants where it would say what they are good for and why they're recommended, and what zones and what types of soil they would do best in.
So, you look at native plant catalogs that'll give you information. My website has, I think, a page on it that gives some of that information. I found no one catalog perfect, where they put both, you know, they put height and color, time of year of bloom, soil type, moisture, light conditions, type of root system. So I've created my own database, but so you'd have to go look in catalogs. There are, one of the places you can see is the Great Lakes Gardens at Mathai Botanical Gardens in Ann Arbor. They've created all the different kinds of ecosystems throughout the Great Lakes there and put plants in them. Cranbrook also has native gardens with plants labeled. But when you go look at those gardens, you're not going to see what kinds of conditions, you know, a listing of what kinds of conditions they like, but you'll be able to see those conditions that they like.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Amy, I think we got your question, right? Okay.
Yeah, yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, Valerie, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have a large portion of my front yard, which is a septic finger system. I saw on your root slide, there was something there that had fairly shallow roots. Is there anything that could safely be planted on top of that? Is that sedges or something?
Yes, yes. In fact, you can plant deep-rooted. Hang on. You can plant deep-rooted native species on top of a septic field, as long as they are upland species and not wetland species, because the roots of an upland plant, once it hits all that water in there, the roots will stop. You can read more about that on the Minnesota Department DNR website. I don't quite know where it is. It's a number of years old, but maybe if you go there and Google plantings on top of septic systems, really the only things you don't want to put on them are trees and shrubs, but you could, trees, shrubs, and wetland species. But you can put upland native species on top of a septic.
You said that was Minnesota DNR?
Minnesota DNR.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, there's a question that came in is, what is a small columnar, C-O-L-U-M-N-A-R, oak we can use? I don't know if you answered that or not.
Pin oak? Pin oak, P-I-N? I don't know the botanical name for a pin oak.
Oh, it's the word is, what is a small columnar, C-O-L-U-M-N-A-R?
Yep, columnar.
Yeah.
Something that is more like this rather than spread out. And if it's an oak, it would be a pin oak, I believe.
Okay. And go ahead, Ann.
Hi, Drew. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was 100% on board with you all the way up to about the part where everyone was cringing about the herbicide, but
Right.
that's not what my question is about. And I love Doug telling me. I've read several of his books. He's just right on. I'm so grateful for all of what you're doing. And
you probably noticed that I have some of his slides.
yeah, he's just really, I love the whole idea of us having our own little spot of land, and that's all, if that's all we have to work with, you know, and then if you can get your neighbors involved, that's even better. So I totally relate to you about being kind of like a lone island in the world in some ways.
Right.
But my actual question is about your garden beds that have the standing water and your pond. Do you do anything to agitate the water, or is there anything else you do to minimize the mosquito breeding of any sort, or do the other insects take care of that and the birds and stuff?
I purposely did not want to run electricity to it, you know, to filter it or anything. So I do need to fish some algae out of it from time to time. You know, just take a small rake and I pull it out, and then I just throw it in my beds. For I do run my sump pump into it. And so it actually overflows into that wet area that I actually didn't even build the pond, but has standing water in it all the time. So it is getting a, fresh dose of water every 15 to 30 minutes, depending
Okay.
on how wet or dry it is. And so since there isn't much agitation going on in it, you might think there'd be a lot of mosquitoes, but also because of that, I have dragonflies breeding in there, and dragonfly larvae's favorite food are mosquito larvae. But I do throw mosquito dunks in, which is a bacterium. And if you Google mosquito dunk, I think you'll find it. It's Bacillus thuringiensis subspecies israelensis, maybe.
Okay.
And it supposedly only attacks mosquito larvae.
Thank you.
That's the only external kind of thing that I do to control the mosquitoes. And I don't have any more mosquitoes than anywhere else in my neighborhood.
Thank you.
All right, this next call is, forgive me if I say your name wrong, Biljana. Go ahead. Biljana, are you still there? Did I say your name wrong?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, that's my wife's, my name's Jamie. That's my wife's name. Hi, how are you doing? A good show.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, I got around 5 acres, and over my septic field, or the leach field, I should say, when I had it installed, let's say 5 years ago, I had it, tilled and leveled from the septic field install, and I ordered, oh God, I forgot the amount of seeds. It was quite costly from Cardinal Seed. Have you heard of Cardinal? So I had I don't know if you could see, can you see my picture? It's quite a huge bag of seed, probably $400 or $500 for the seed to do this leach field. And so I put that in, and some of it's coming up nicely. It was all for, I kind of picked it for the area. I forgot if I was doing a mesic mix, I think it was. So how do we keep, is that wild parsnips or wild carrot that comes up in there?
Yeah, Queen Anne's lace.
Yeah,
I wouldn't worry about Queen Anne's lace.
You do not?
I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay, because this stuff out here gets pretty insane. That
How long ago did you sow the seeds?
I would say 4 years ago.
Where do you live?
Northwest Indiana, so near Chicago.
Holy shit, you come from a long way away. Excuse me. Find somebody who will burn it for you. Set it on fire. And you may find it improves dramatically very quickly.
Describe burn. How can you do that with a hand torch, or do you have to? You're looking to set the area.
How big is the area?
Oh, dude, I wish I had more precise measurements for you. The leach field, let's just say a couple in-ground swimming pools, maybe Olympic-sized swimming pool,
So my recommendation is always for somebody who hasn't burned for you, or somebody who hasn't burned, is to get a professional to burn it for you.
Okay. Too late to do that right now?
You can still do that now. You can actually burn it anytime. Usually burn season is March and April. while the stuff is still kind of dead and brown and will carry fire. So you could try doing it in the fall. Get somebody to do it for you in the fall. But look up burn contractors. Get them to come over. Get them to tell you what they think.
I like that. Yeah.
It's more difficult to burn in the summer just because everything's green. So really, March is the prime month for burning.
Yeah, stuff is starting to come up right now. I'd hate to do it, it's.
You won't
like,
kill it. You won't kill it. It's really just a matter is it too green to burn?
Yeah, true. But do you now I listened to your other question what she was talking about doing a field and doing the roundup and that stuff. You cutting down the field once a year at the end. I kind of like I've read to cut it once a year to keep non-native stuff, or if the calorie pair pops up in there or whatever, to keep that kind of stuff down. But I don't like to cut it, but I did go over it. I shouldn't have, and I wasn't thinking. I guess I did go over it this spring with the mower, and I know that was a bad thing.
Yeah, you could do that. You could do that periodically. I don't think you need to do that every year. I mean, the best thing would be to burn it every 3 to 5 years. So, you're 4 years out, burn it next spring.
3 to 5 burns. Okay. All right. That's nice.
Right. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Katie wrote in a question. Sorry if this was discussed. Could I get your thoughts on smothering with straw? I'm currently smothering a large area to replant with native wildflowers. I'm smothering mostly switchgrass and crabgrass.
Well, switchgrass is native. If that crabgrass doesn't get light, those seeds may just remain in the soil until they get light. So, that might work, but it depends on what kind of a planting you're going to do. If you're going to do crabgrass, will eventually drop out. I'm not that worried about crabgrass generally, particularly if it's a seeded. But it's tricky. It's tricky to get seedings to work right. You need to make sure that you really do have dead vegetation. You need to make sure you get good seed to soil contact. You need to make sure that the first year after you've seeded it, that you actually cut it so that you are taking the tops off the annual weeds so that they don't add to the weed seed bank. I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer or not, but if you smother it with something, you're really going to need to smother it for most of a growing season, if not a whole year.
Thank you. And Jennifer Panic writes, Illinois wildflowers.info website is a great resource for telling what types of insects pollinate plants or use them as host plant.
That would be correct.
Okay. And Ann asks, is sudden oak disease also called oak wilt disease?
Same thing.
All right. And Jennifer writes, Charles Downing's no-dig method is fantastic. It eliminates need for herbicide when starting your landscape.
Okay.
And Amy writes, check with local fire departments on burn regulations.
Absolutely.
And Katie, along with me, says, thank you. Is there any more questions? Did I miss anybody? All right. Melissa writes, what are a few more fragrant native species?
That depends upon the conditions that you have. So If it's dry, prairie dropseed grass is probably the most fragrant thing that I know of. Spice bush is fragrant, but both those things require very different conditions.
Okay. And any more questions? I do have one question for you, Drew. Do you have a book, or do you have one that you're planning to write or come out?
No, no. If you're going to read one thing, read one of either of Doug Tallamy's books.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Drew, for a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
for having
everyone. Do you have anything else to add, Drew?
I do not.
Okay. Well, thank everyone for joining us this evening for Landscaping with Native Plants with Drew Lathin. I apologize for those who didn't get in, and for those who came late. I guess there was some confusion with the that were Eastern time. People thought it might have been other times. However, this will be on, this is being recorded and will be on YouTube in a couple days. And also, please join us for future webinar talks such as Murder Michigan with Tobin Burke on May 19th at 7 p.m. And on May 20th at 7, we will be having How We Can Prevent Future Pandemics with Dr. Aisha Akhtar. And on May 24th at 2 p.m., Dr. Salish Rao will be talking on healing the earth with preventing our extinctions. All events that are in-house for May have been canceled, whether we are open or not. When the library will open is still yet to be determined, as among, I guess, a lot of things. Stay connected with us at dhcl.mishlibrary.org and on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube, where you find some other presentations such on how to do crafts, painting, stories, puppets, and book talks. If you have any questions for me specifically on the library, or you wish to leave comments about tonight's program, you can email us at dhrefrence that's DHREFERENCE @gmail.com. For the Carolyn Kennedy Library in Dearborn Heights, this is Rob Butler, and thank you for tuning in.